All right, let's dive right into it. Today, in this explainer, we're unpacking Charles Dickens's absolute masterpiece, David Copperfield. And we're going to explore how he used this specific story to process his own very real childhood trauma, while completely redefining the idea of social mobility in Victorian England. We're looking at a narrative that is just so much more than a classic piece of literature. It's this profound, deep dive into identity, resilience, and what it actually means to rise up in society. Dickens wasn't just, writing fiction here. He was holding a massive mirror up to the harsh realities of the 19th century. And as we're going to see, he was looking directly into his own past, too.
To really get why this book hits so hard, you just have to look at this famous confession from the author himself. He wrote this right in the preface to the book, and honestly, it instantly changes how you read the whole thing. This isn't just some tale he spun out of thin air, right? This is the closest Dickens ever came to an actual autobiography. He literally poured his own heartbreaks, his struggles with grinding poverty, and his eventual triumphs directly into the character of David. Once you realize David's journey is heavily inspired by Dickens's actual life, the emotional weight of the whole story completely shifts.
Now, if we want to really decode David's journey, we got to talk about the framework first. The literary genre here is the Bildungsroman. Basically, it's a coming-of-age story, but it's a very specific kind. It's a quest for meaning, where the protagonist is completely shaped by their early experiences, their mistakes, and their conflicts. It's all about how they eventually find their true identity and their place in the world. So as we go through this, keep that framework in the back of your mind. We are tracking a psychological evolution, going from a totally vulnerable kid to a morally mature adult.
So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with Dickens's favorite child, move into surviving Victorian child labor, follow the journey to adulthood, and then finally wrap up with redefining social mobility.
All right, let's get into part one, Dickens's favorite child and the autobiographical mirror.
It's honestly wild how directly we can map Dickens's real-life nightmares right onto David's fictional life. It completely grounds the story in this harsh historical reality. Just think about Dickens himself for a second. He suffered this massive, life-altering trauma when his father was sent to debtor's prison. That forced a 12-year-old Charles to go work in a grueling, filthy blacking factory. Now compare that to David, fatherless from birth and later forced by his absolute terror of a stepfather to work in the sordid Murdstone and Grinby's warehouse. The parallels are just striking. Dickens is clearly using that fictional warehouse as a stand-in for the real-life factory that scarred him. He's working through his own feelings of being this lost, alienated kid through David.
Which brings us to part 2. Surviving Victorian child labor and the trauma of the factory.
During the Industrial Revolution, children, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, were forced into factories and mines, and they were working a staggering 12 to 16 hours a day. I mean, just let that number sink in for a second. 12 to 16 hours. The working poor in Victorian England basically had zero social safety net. After the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 slashed public relief, destitute families were pushed into workhouses. So families literally had no choice but to send their kids to work just to avoid starving. And factory owners loved it, because kids had small hands for fine work and could be paid peanuts compared to adults. No education, no playtime, just exhausting labor.
So David's descent into the warehouse, it's not just a sad plot point. It's this brilliant, brutal illustration of an economic system that literally commodified children. Dickens doesn't just hand us the dry, historical facts of child labor, he makes you feel the psychological horror of it. Through David, we feel that exact moment a child loses their innocence, the intense, crushing loneliness of being stripped of your identity. Dickens is delivering a massive social critique here. He's saying that a society driven purely by industrial efficiency and, strict utilitarianism fundamentally destroys its most vulnerable people.
Moving right along to part 3, the journey to adulthood, or the anatomy of a Bildungsroman. So how does a kid actually survive all that and become a functioning adult? Well, this timeline maps out the pivotal stages of David's life. We're seeing that classic Bildungsroman structure play out. He starts in this sort of idyllic, innocent state, but that gets completely shattered by his stepfather. The factory work is rock bottom, just total isolation and suffering. But then comes the turning point. He makes this incredibly brave, desperate decision to run away and seek refuge with his Aunt Betsy. That one act of agency propels him into adolescence. He finally gets actual care and education, which sets the entire stage for him to mature properly. And the crucial takeaway here is the total night and day contrast between the people raising him. On one hand, you have the tyrannical hurdle set up by his stepfather. Mr. Murdstone's idea of raising a kid is violence, isolation, and this oppressive control that treats a child like a wild animal to be broken. But on the other hand, you have Aunt Betsy and mentors like Mr. Wickfield. They offer David something totally radical for his life so far: compassion. They send him to Dr. Strong's school, where learning isn't some cruel punishment, but a real tool for cognitive and moral growth. Dickens is hammering home that your environment, specifically the people you surround yourself with, is absolutely critical to who you become. And with Aunt Betsy's help, education becomes the ultimate transformative tool for David. It's how he builds his identity and eventually finds huge success as a writer. We've got this quote here from Nelson Mandela. And yeah, it's from a totally different era, but it points to a universal truth that Dickens deeply understood. For David, going to school isn't just about, memorizing dates or Latin grammar. It is the exact mechanism that lets him process his past. It helps him develop self-reliance and build his own moral compass. It's literally the thing that lets him transition from being a victim of his circumstances to being the author of his own destiny.
And that leads us perfectly into our final section, Part 4, Redefining Social Mobility and the True Engine of Success.
Because Dickens needs us really, to stop and ask this critical question. Can a person genuinely rise up in a heavily class-stratified society just by stacking up wealth? You have to remember, Victorian society was completely obsessed with social climbing. Status, old money, inheritances, those were the ultimate markers of winning at life. But Dickens saw the dark, ugly underbelly of that industrial economy, and he calls the whole thing into question. Think about it. If you gain the whole world but lose your moral center in the process, did you actually move up? To really drive this home, researchers love comparing David Copperfield to another Dickens heavyweight, Great Expectations. It's a perfect contrast. Over in Great Expectations, Pip wants to be a gentleman to win over Estella. Actually, scratch that. He thinks money equals being a gentleman. He equates mobility with cash and status, and because of that, he alienates his real friends and ends up totally disillusioned. But then look at David. David never treats social mobility like it's a finish line. His incredible rise from a traumatized, impoverished kid to a successful writer is driven by resilience, kindness, and just a raw desire to better himself intellectually. Pip climbs the social ladder and falls as a person. David grows as a person, and the ladder just naturally appears beneath him.
So what's the secret sauce? Dickens's ultimate message is that true, lasting social ascent is built on these specific virtues. It's not about inherited status. It's embodied perfectly in David's final, mature relationship with Agnes Wickfield. Dickens isn't saying you can't move up in the world, but he's completely rewiring the engine that gets you there. It's not about who your parents are or a random mysterious benefactor dropping bags of cash in your lap. It's about perseverance when you're stuck in the warehouse. It's about having moral integrity when you're dealing with manipulative people like Uriah Heep. And most importantly, it's about the meaningful, empathetic connections you build with everyday people like the humble Peggotty family.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this somewhat provocative thought to chew on. Dickens looked around at a Victorian world that was totally obsessed with surface-level wealth, and he challenged everyone to look deeper. Through David Copperfield, he showed us that overcoming your past and rising up isn't about escaping who you were, but about letting those exact hardships forge you into somebody better. So, as you go about your day, maybe ask yourself, are you climbing for status or are you climbing for character? What is the true engine of your own social mobility? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into Dickens's favorite child, and I really hope it sparked a new perspective on what it means to actually succeed.